Here at the Summit in Houston.
January 9th, 1980. The Denver Nuggets are at Houston playing the Rockets. Houston's roster at the time had 4 notable players, guys who would all go on to make the Hall of Fame. Rick Barry, at the age of 35, was playing his final season. There was also point guard Calvin Murphy. The team was led by 24-year-old superstar Moses Malone. And lastly, they had Rudy Tomjanovich, a name that would have surely been lost to all of time if not for the most infamous punch in basketball history. There's many interpretations of how this event unfolded, but I'll explain the most common one. On December 9th, 1977, the below 500 Rockets faced the also below 500 LA Lakers in what would be another meaningless game, since both teams wouldn't even come close to sniffing a championship. Meaninglessness is interesting. The word meaning has an ambiguous definition. Either some things can have meaning or none at all, or maybe everything. There is no concrete way to define it. We just go by what most people would accept as meaningful in certain contexts and meaningless in that same context. And in the context of NBA games, this should have been a meaningless one, but it wasn't. But the meaning of this game had nothing to do with the game itself, not who won, because the Rockets did 116 to 105, or the in-game stats, because Malone had 20 points, 16 rebounds, 8 of which were on the offensive glass that night. It was his first season as an NBA player following the NBA-ABA merger occurring. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar did his best carry job with 32 points, 7 rebounds, and 4 blocks that night. None of that mattered though. These all-time legends going head-to-head wasn't the front page news, because following a scuffle between Lakers big Kermit Washington and Rockets big Kevin Coonard, I apologize if I mispronounced that name, Tomjanovich ran towards the brawl that at one point included Jabbar himself to play peacemaker. Unfortunately, Washington seeing Tomjanovich charging towards him threw a floating right hook that broke Tomjanovich's face, nose, and jaw and left him unconscious on the hardwood with his own blood and spinal fluid leaking into his head after also suffering a cerebral concussion. Tomjanovich thankfully just barely survived. He missed the remainder of the season, and Washington was fined for $10,000, which was probably like his whole contract since the 70s, and was suspended for 26 games. Anyways, a bunch of things also happened. This video is not about either of those guys, so let's get back to the present. Well, not the present, 1980, but you get what I mean. Malone finished that January 9th game with 28 points and 14 rebounds. Calvin Murphy would contribute with 31 points. Calvin Murphy was 5'9", 165 pounds. He made one All-Star in his 13-year career and would make the Hall of Fame somehow. That night though, he played like one. He went 5 of 5 from the line, which is no surprise since he's the 10th highest career free throw percentage of all time. His teammate Rick Barry is 4th. Opposite the Rockets was the Denver team that left much to be desired. At that point they were 16 and 29 and would finish the season 30 and 52. Denver did have some pieces though. In chess terms, they had a king and a queen. The queen was a man they had traded for, the 1975 MVP and future Hall of Famer George McGinnis, who they traded in exchange for 5-time All-Star Ralph Sampson and also future Hall of Famer and 11-time All-Defensive Team Maker Bobby Jones. But despite that asking price of 2 really good players, McGinnis posted 30 points, 14 rebounds, 6.3 assists, and almost 3 steals during his MVP campaign, and maintained similar numbers following it, so the deal was a no-brainer for Denver at the time. Plus, McGinnis couldn't really coexist with his co-star, who was none other than Dr. J. Julius Erving, and if your front office is choosing between one of those guys, I think you'd rather keep Julius Erving. McGinnis was great in that first year in Denver, putting up all-star numbers in 78-79, but this season he regressed tremendously, and looking ahead he'd never regain that all-star form, let alone his MVP form he once had. Denver would trade him not too long after this game. At the deadline, almost exactly a month after this game, they trade for a young and rising star. And despite trading a former MVP for an unproven kid, this trade would go on to be considered Denver's greatest trade, because that unproven kid was Alex the Blade English. But that has nothing to do with this tale. The winter night was breezy. No, really, I checked the weather. It was nice that night. The weather was at the 50s by the evening, plus it's Houston, which is technically a tropical climate. I'm so serious. So the weather was perfect for a stroll in the park or to watch a basketball game. And for those in attendance that lovely night, McGinnis gave them a show to cheer against. He balled out. Forget the disappointing campaign he is currently undergoing and will continue to undergo. Tonight, he went back to 1975. 43 points, 82% from the field, 12 rebounds, 5 assists, and 4 steals. He was a man on a mission. There were 8,225 attending, so about half capacity for the Compact Center. Those 8,200 fans, as satisfied as they must have been watching McGinnis, were not there to see him. They were attending just to see one guy, the other guy, the king of Denver's chess set. They were there to see David Thompson, the Skywalker. David O'Neal Thompson was born on July 13, 1954 in Boiling Springs, North Carolina, which is about an hour drive from Charlotte. Thompson had the humblest of beginnings. Being the youngest of 11 siblings, his family would play ball all day after church in their little dirt yard. The rim was a literal bicycle wheel with the spokes off. He played varsity as a freshman attending Crest Senior High School in Shelby, North Carolina, which was pretty easy for him since he dunked a basketball for the first time in the 8th grade when he was only 5'8". After he graduated, he'd stay home and go to North Carolina State, where his 42-inch vertical jump would put him in the Guinness Book of World Records, and he did this as a freshman, I might add. He would do great things as a collegiate athlete. From 1972 to 74, the Wolfpack would have a total win-loss record of 57-1. Yes, 1 loss in 2 full years of ACC basketball. In the 74 NCAA tournament semifinals, Thompson with 28 points would lead his Wolfpack against a UCLA team that had won 7 straight national titles at that point. And just 2 days later, he'd conquer Marquette in a cruising win that would bring NC State their first ever national title. His incredible stats, on top of all these accolades, will put him in the highest echelon of ACC athletes, with the likes of Michael Jordan, Christian Laettner, and Len Bias. He'd signed with the pre-merger Denver Nuggets of the ABA in 1975. He'd go on to win Rookie of the Year, averaging an astounding 26 points and 6 rebounds a night. He'd also make the All-Star team as rookie, which is a feat only done by the game's greatest, such as Michael Jordan and Magic Johnson. And just like Magic, he'd make the finals his rookie year, except he didn't win it all like Magic, but he did before him, so he set the trend. A recurring theme of Thompson's legacy. Well, okay, there were like 9 teams in the ABA total, and 2 of them were folded during the season, so there was really like 7, and like 5 teams made the playoffs, so the Nuggets really had to win 1 series to make the finals. But my point about Thompson still stands, since if it were that easy to make the finals, someone else would have made it. But no, it was him as a rookie who did. He just couldn't get the cherry on top. The main reason being is that the Nuggets would match up against the New York Nets, who were led by Julius Erving in the 76 ABA Finals. Thompson put up 28 points, 6.3 rebounds, and 3 assists, but Denver would lose in 6, even with Thompson having a great closeout game. By the way, this Denver team had 4 Hall of Famers as well. Erving had no Hall of Fame teammates, but the man put up 37.7 points, 14 rebounds, and 5 assists on 60% shooting. That is some god-tier final stats. He didn't need any Hall of Fame teammates. Clearly, he was enough. The NBA-ABA merger would happen following the 76 finals. The Nuggets would be one of the teams that got transferred into the NBA. The next 3 years, Thompson would average 25.7 points, 6.6 rebounds, 4 assists, 1 steal, and 1 block. He'd make the All-Star team in each of those years. He'd also make the All-NBA first team consecutively in 77 and 78. On the last day of the 78 season, Thompson would drop 73 points against the Pistons. He would have won the game as the Pistons won 139 to 137. Yes, this was an actual game in the 70s, a year before they implemented the three-point line. They also did this in regulation, not OT. I mean, for the times, it's just a crazy endgame score to look at. Funny enough, Thompson wouldn't even win the scoring title either. The Iceman still won that and by a couple of decimal points because he scored 63 later that day. After 78, Thompson signed a record $4 million 5-year extension, which would average out to about $800,000 a year. I know that's not a lot nowadays. For reference, that's less than what Kyle Singler is making this season, and you don't know who that is. The Nuggets MVP and superstar Nikola Jokic will make that amount every 9 days this upcoming season. The league has come really far. But guys like Thompson set the trail, never forget. And still, $800,000 annually is a lot of money, especially if you throw in inflation, which makes it about $3.5 million a year, and that's not bad at all. Going into the 79-80 season, Thompson felt he had to prove that he was worth that contract, and the pressure was mounting on him. And it really seemed as if he was worth every penny. He was averaging 21 points, 4.5 rebounds, and 3 assists a night going into that January 9th game. He'd have 31 points, 6 rebounds, 3 assists on 71% from the field in that game. McGinnis obviously stole the show, but Thompson still put in work. That didn't matter since this game was meaningless. Like, I've looked everywhere, but I can't find any footage of the game itself. Literally, besides the in-game stats recorded, the only things about this game that are ever talked about was the fact that David Thompson got injured during it. Thompson would miss the rest of the season, leaving this game with a torn ligament away from his left heel. They never specify what specific ligament he tore, but an assumption can be made that he tore the long plantar ligament since he'd been suffering from plantar fasciitis since early last season. Till this game, the pain had been bearable, but following the tear, he'd missed the remainder of the 1980 season. You see, after his foot injury, Thompson had a lot of time on his hands, and during his rehabilitation period, became more pervasive in his life. After signing his record contract in 78, the fame and pressure of being the face of the NBA took a toll on Thompson mentally. He'd resort to drugs and alcohol consumption to deal with his woes. His substance abuse was maintainable before the injury, but during his time rehabbing, he'd felt so isolated and lonely that he could no longer control it. His feelings could be categorized today as depression, and he could have gotten the help he needed through the countless avenues the league has created to assist its players that are dealing with mental health problems. But this was the 80s, so there was still a strong stigma towards treating unchecked mental health issues. So the only way for Thompson to deal with his overwhelming feelings was to turn to his vices. To quote David Thompson, "I wasn't a daily user. I was more or less a splurge user. I would try to stop completely, but I didn't have the willpower. I knew I needed outside help." Thompson never wanted to be in the spotlight. He was a true hooper. The man just loved the game, not the attention that came with it. Not too many guys like that today. Most of them chase what Thompson had. A guy like Kawhi Leonard comes to mind when you think of a star who's not looking for the attention. The drugs that Thompson partook in aren't all going to be listed somewhere, since why would they be? But his heaviest usage was definitely cocaine, the real king of the 80s. It was a daily thing for Thompson, along with the absolute limit of alcohol a 20-year-old's liver could consume. His drug use got so bad at one point that his wife, Kathy Thompson, called the authorities on David's dealer to get him arrested so he couldn't deal to David anymore. Their marriage had its ups and downs, but they stayed with each other through it all. She would pass away in 2016. Now the 1980-81 season is what I like to call revisionist history. If you're looking at any bios about Thompson, they'll state that at this point, after his injury in 1980, he'd become a shell of himself. All his talent and athleticism zapped away, and he would become a washed star. But that's incorrect. That would happen in 82. His stats in 81 were superb. Honestly, he had one of the best statistical seasons of his career in 81. He averaged 25 points, 4 rebounds, and 3 assists. But he wouldn't make All-Star that year, or receive any praise for his age 26 season. His substance abuse had come to the surface. He was missing practice and was distancing himself from the team. He'd get hit with a suspension for violating club rules, and the team would lose any cohesion they had with their star player constantly coming in and out the lineup. Funny enough, the best stretch of games where they won 4 out of 5, yes, they were very mediocre. Thompson averaged 34.6 points per game. He averaged 28 in their last games to close out the year. He was great when he was on the court. He stilled a Skywalker, But off the court is where the problem started. David couldn't effortlessly leap over his troubles quite like his counterpart could. The 1981 Nuggets finished 37-45, fourth in the Midwest Division. In 82, the decision was made to take Thompson out of the starting five and have him come off the bench. He'd averaged 15 points, 2.4 rebounds, and 2 assists that season. His struggles with addiction and his nagging injuries had turned what should have been the start of his prime at the age of 37 into a diminished role. Denver finished that season 46-36, second in the division, and they'd move forward, leaving Thompson by the road. The Nuggets would trade Thompson to the Seattle Supersonics. His Supersonics arc was brief and seemed to give hope. He made All-Star in 83, but it was all a facade. David would be checked into a rehab center in Denver in 83. In 84, he was involved in an altercation at a nightclub where he'd fall down a set of stairs, injuring his knee. This injury would be career-ending. In 1985, he tried out for the Indiana Pacers, which was his last shot at making it back in the NBA. Despite only being 30 and 4 years removed from an All-NBA first-team selection, he wouldn't make the roster. The same night he failed to make the roster, he'd be arrested for intoxication. Now at his lowest, he was reportedly spending $1,000 a day on cocaine, which, let's be honest, seems like an exaggeration. In 87, he'd be sentenced to 180 days in prison after a domestic dispute with his wife. He'd end up in detention and be checked into a rehab center in Seattle. There he sat only 10 years removed from the start of his professional career. From the highest of peaks, he'd fallen so far. Who's to say if the game against the Rockets is to blame for his downward spiral? It's been 8 years to that point, and it has, in all purpose, become another meaningless game. But maybe if he hadn't experienced the loneliness that came with his injury rehabilitation in 1980, his drug addiction might not have devoured him. It's the butterfly effect. Every little action has a reaction, and those reactions continue to extend forever. Was this the culprit behind the tragedy of David Thompson's career? Probably not. But it shows how easily someone can lose it all. Every little meaningless event has a consequence. So in reality, nothing is meaningless. This story thankfully has a happy ending. After his stint in rehab in 87, David would find his lifeline in religion, becoming a devout Christian. Thompson's legacy would stand the test of time. As a North Carolina legend, he would be Michael Jordan's greatest inspiration. Thompson is considered to be the Jordan prototype, a fact proven by Mike, who brought Thompson on to induct him into the Hall of Fame in 09. Thompson himself entered the Hall of Fame back in 96, 5 All-Star appearances and 2 All-NBA selections. His short stint of greatness was undeniable, and basketball fans around the world accepted that. Today he is remembered more for his flash of greatness and as the wary tale of what can happen when the wrong things perverse your life. He is an NBA legend. To quote David Thompson, "The average fan just doesn't realize that. I've always tried to do the right thing, do the best I could."